I want you to picture St. Patrick's Day. Like, what immediately comes to mind?
Oh, probably green beer.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If you are like most people, you are probably picturing rowdy street parades, a pint of green beer, those oversized novelty leprechaun hats.
Yeah, you see those everywhere.
You really do. And maybe even entire rivers dyed a vibrant fluorescent green. It is this massive, incredibly distinct cultural aesthetic.
It's totally unmistakable.
Right. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about this holiday is actually, well, a modern invention?
Yeah, that's the crazy part.
It is. What if I told you that these traditions were largely created thousands of miles away from Ireland, and the man the day is named after wasn't even Irish to begin with?
It is genuinely one of the most remarkable historical makeovers we have on record. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of cultural history that is, incredibly murky.
Super murky.
Yeah. The myths have totally overshadowed the historical reality. It's basically created a version of the past that serves the present rather than reflecting what actually happened.
And our mission for this deep dive is to untangle all of that. We have a comprehensive stack of historical and cultural source material in front of us, and we are going to unpack the bizarre, centuries-long evolution of St. Patrick's Day.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. We are going to explore exactly how a somber, strictly religious feast day transformed into like the most widely celebrated national festival on Earth.
Yep.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even touch on the parades and the pints of stout, we have to start with the actual guy the day is named after.
We have to.
Because looking at his real story in the sources, it reads way more like a grim survival narrative than the cheerful folklore we all grew up with.
Absolutely. I mean, the man we call St. Patrick was actually born in Roman Britain. This was in the 4th century.
Right, Roman Britain, so not Ireland at all.
Not at all. He was born into a wealthy Romano-British family. His father was a Christian deacon, and his grandfather was a priest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was living a very comfortable, established life in this civilized outpost of the Roman Empire.
So he basically has everything going for him.
Pretty much.
And then at the age of 16, his entire world just collapses. I mean, he doesn't just decide to visit Ireland on a whim, right? He is taken there by force.
Right. According to the Declaration, which is a document allegedly written by Patrick himself, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders.
That is just terrifying to think about.
It is. He was dragged across the sea as a slave to Gaelic Ireland. And you have to remember, at the time, this was a completely foreign pagan landscape to him.
A total culture shock on top of the trauma.
Exactly. He was forced to work as a shepherd in total isolation. He was exposed to the elements, completely stripped of his former identity, and he endured that captivity for 6 grueling years.
6 years. 6 years as an enslaved teenager. I want you to just, imagine the psychological toll of that.
It's unimaginable.
But the Declaration says he doesn't break. He claims he actually found God during this isolation. And eventually, a divine voice told him to flee to the coast where a ship was waiting.
And he actually makes it.
Yeah. He escapes, makes this perilous journey all the way back home to Britain, and eventually becomes a priest.
Which is an incredible feat on its own, just surviving that ordeal and making it home.
Seriously.
But the turning point of his legend, however, is his decision to return. Tradition holds that he made the conscious, incredibly dangerous choice to go back to the very people who enslaved him.
That is wild. I mean, why go back?
Well, this time, he went as a missionary. He was determined to convert the pagan Irish to Christianity. And the sources say he spent years traveling the northern half of Ireland, reportedly converting thousands of people.
I'm looking at the sources on how he actually accomplished those conversions, and it brings us to, the most famous part of his legend, the shamrock.
Ah, yes, the shamrock.
Right. So the story goes that he used the 3-leaf shamrock to explain the concept of the Holy Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yep.
But I want you to think about the marketing challenge here. If you were trying to introduce a completely abstract, foreign theological concept to a new demographic, you can't just, hand them a dense philosophical manuscript.
You really can't.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is exactly why that specific botanical symbol was so incredibly effective. You have to understand the audience he was speaking to.
Right.
The number 3 was already highly significant in pagan Ireland. The Celts had this cosmological vision of triplicity.
Oh, interesting. So they already cared about the number 3.
Deeply. They worshipped many triple deities, and their art was full of the triskel, which is this threefold spiral motif.
So he essentially looked at their culture, saw how deeply embedded the number 3 was, and just picked up a weed from the dirt to bridge the gap. That's like brilliant local marketing.
It really is.
Yeah.
And whether it was a deliberate genius strategy by Patrick himself or, just a clever legend projected onto him centuries later by the church, it worked.
Right. The outcome is the same.
Exactly. There is no hard historical evidence that the shamrock itself was sacred to the pagan Irish, but the threefold visual certainly was. He basically packaged a radical new religion in a deeply familiar native visual.
Making the transition feel natural rather than forced.
Precisely.
And that shamrock visual is so powerful that today it dictates the entire aesthetic of the holiday. I mean, you literally cannot celebrate this day without wearing green.
No, you'd stand out like a sore thumb.
Right. But flipping through our historical sources reveals a massive contradiction here, because the color originally associated with St. Patrick wasn't green at all.
Nope.
It was blue.
Yeah, it's St. Patrick's blue. If we look back to 1783, the Order of St. Patrick, which was this Anglo-Irish chivalric order, adopted blue as its official color.
Wow.
Yeah, for a very long time, if you were depicting the saint or his order, you used a very specific shade of blue.
I am genuinely struggling to reconcile this. Today, if I wear blue on March 17th, I am going to get pinched by my coworkers.
You definitely will.
So how do we get from official chivalric blue to mandatory fluorescent green?
Well, the transition has deeply layered roots, and the first layer is pure mythology. The earliest association of the color green with the concept of Ireland actually comes from an 11th century legend.
Okay.
It's about a figure named Goidel Glass, which translates to Godidel the Green. He's considered the eponymous ancestor of the Gaels.
Okay, so where does the green come in?
According to this myth, he was bitten by a venomous snake. But his life was saved when the biblical figure Moses placed his staff on the snake bite.
Wait, Moses. The idea of an Irish ancestor doing a crossover episode with Moses in the desert is just incredible to me.
It really highlights how mythologies blend over time. The story claims that the healing touch left Godi with a distinct green mark.
Oh, I see.
Furthermore, his descendants were prophesied to eventually settle in a land entirely free of snakes.
Which points straight to Ireland.
Exactly. So when one of his descendants supposedly caught sight of a beautiful green island in the distance, an island famously lacking native snakes, the association between the people, the land, and the color green was cemented in folklore.
That's a great story, but folklore doesn't really explain how a color becomes a mandatory uniform for millions of people.
No, it doesn't.
The sources show the true, hard political shift to the color green happened centuries later in the 1790s. And this wasn't about cheerful spring colors. This was actually incredibly dangerous.
It was deadly. The 1790s brought the era of the United Irishmen. They were a revolutionary Republican organization.
Right.
They were founded mostly by Protestants, but they had a massive Catholic membership. Their whole goal was to launch a rebellion against British rule, which culminated in the 1798 rebellion.
So they needed a symbol.
Exactly. They needed a unifying symbol, and they adopted the color green. Suddenly, wearing green wasn't about a myth anymore. It was a direct declaration of treason against the British crown.
The sources mention a very famous song from that era called The Wearing of the Green, and it is literally a song about members of the United Irishmen being persecuted, punished, and even killed just for displaying the color on their clothing.
It's pretty heavy stuff. At that same time, in 1795, William Drennan, who was a co-founder of the United Irishmen, wrote a poem that coined the phrase the Emerald Isle.
Wow, so that's where that comes from.
Yeah, the color was truly becoming weaponized as a tool for national identity.
And they clearly didn't let that go. Fast forward to 1922, the Irish Free State is finally founded, and they take this color association to a literal extreme.
They really did.
The sources say the new government ordered that all the old British red post boxes across the country be painted green. Their actual stated slogan was "Green paint for green people."
That's a strong statement.
Yeah, and by 1924, they had introduced a green Irish passport. But here's what I don't understand.
Okay.
You have people being severely punished for wearing green in the 1790s. It is a deadly political statement. How does a symbol of violent rebellion get so diluted that millions of people worldwide wear it to a party without even knowing the history?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the life cycle of cultural movements and emigration. Political symbols often lose their dangerous, revolutionary edge as they travel across oceans and generations.
Makes sense.
For the Irish diaspora, the millions of people who left Ireland wearing green stopped being a way to signal participation in an act of rebellion. Instead, it morphed into a generalized badge of cultural pride.
It became a safe way to say, I belong to this heritage.
Exactly.
Which means the transition from a dangerous political statement to a light-hearted party wasn't primarily driven by the people living in Ireland, it was driven by the people who left.
Yeah, and this might actually be the most surprising fact in our entire stack of sources. The very first St. Patrick's Day parades did not happen in Ireland.
Still blows my mind.
They started in North America. The earliest recorded St. Patrick's celebration in what is now the United States took place in St. Augustine, Florida, all the way back in 1601.
Wait, 1601. Long before the United States was even a concept, there was a St. Patrick's Day celebration in Florida.
Yes.
And the data shows that until the late 20th century, this holiday was actually a much bigger deal among the diaspora in places like America, Canada, and Australia than it ever was back in the homeland.
We have to consider the immigrant experience here, particularly during the massive waves of immigration in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay.
Irish immigrants arriving in North America often faced severe prejudice, poverty, and systemic marginalization. They were largely treated as a disadvantaged underclass.
So when they organized these massive, loud public parades down the main streets of major cities like New York and Boston, it wasn't just a party.
Not at all.
It was a massive show of civic strength. It was a way of proving to the local establishment that they had numbers, they had solidarity, and they could not be ignored.
Exactly.
It's almost like having a quiet family tradition, but then you move to a new town where you don't know anyone.
Right, and you feel isolated and often distinctly unwelcome in that new environment.
So to stand out and to prove you belong, you suddenly make that tradition 10 times louder and more colorful than it ever was back home. You basically exaggerate your own traits because it is the anchor connecting you to your identity when you feel like an outsider.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And that exaggerated visibility eventually translated into genuine political power. The diaspora influence grew so potent that the holiday became a formal diplomatic tool.
Which is how we get the Shamrock Bowl.
Yes. By 1952, the Irish ambassador to the U.S. sent a box of shamrocks to President Harry S. Truman.
And that simple gesture evolved into the modern tradition we see today, right? Where the Irish Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, travels to Washington every March to present the U.S. president with a Waterford crystal bowl overflowing with shamrocks.
Yeah, it's a huge diplomatic event now.
But this massively exported, exaggerated version of the holiday has a lot of critics. Our sources highlight a heavy pushback against a concept known as plastic paddiness.
Yeah, plastic paddiness. It's a critical term used to describe the appropriation and misrepresentation of Irish culture, often by people with no actual connection to the country.
Right.
There is deep frustration over how commercialized the holiday has become abroad. It often reduces a very complex culture to a caricature focused entirely on public drunkenness.
The sources specifically mentioned the anger over those cheap leprechaun outfits that flood the parades every year. And I always assume they're just like harmless fairy tale costumes. But the history there is actually pretty dark.
It is very dark. Those specific costumes, the buckled shoes, the exaggerated hats, the red beards, they are heavily based on highly derogatory 19th century caricatures.
Really?
Yes. These were cartoons used by the British and American press to demean Irish immigrants. They portrayed them as aggressive, almost subhuman figures.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah. So seeing those same demeaning stereotypes repackaged and worn as festive party gear today is deeply insulting to many who know the history.
That completely changes how I look at those hats. But I want to pivot back across the Atlantic for a second.
Sure.
While the diaspora was in America and Australia throwing massive parades, taking over streets and wearing green, I want you to imagine what was actually happening back in Ireland on March 17th, because the contrast is staggering.
Oh, it's night and day. For centuries in Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was not a party. It was a strict, holy day of obligation.
So very serious.
Deeply serious religious observance. The focal point of the day was attending Mass. The pubs were quiet, the streets were quiet.
But there was one crucial religious loophole built into the calendar that eventually seeded the global drinking culture we associate with the day. St. Patrick's Day always falls right in the middle of Lent.
Which is key. Lent is the 40-day period of prayer, penance, and fasting leading up to Easter.
Right.
During this time, consuming alcohol and certain rich foods is traditionally forbidden. However, because March 17th was a recognized feast day, the strict Lenten restrictions on fasting and drinking were temporarily lifted.
They hit a 24-hour pause button on the fasting. I imagine that sudden release valve got out of hand pretty quickly.
It certainly created a concentrated window of indulgence. Because of that brief lifting of the rules, drinking alcohol, specifically Irish whiskey, stout, and cider, became an integral part of the afternoon.
And didn't that give rise to a specific custom?
Yes, an old custom called drowning the shamrock. At the end of the night, a shamrock was placed into the bottom of a cup, which was then filled with whiskey or beer and drunk as a final toast to the saint.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. You have this tradition of drowning the shamrock, but when the Irish Free State was finally established in the 1920s, they looked at this growing revelry and they completely shut it down.
They did.
From 1927 all the way until 1961, the Irish Free State legally banned the sale of alcohol on St. Patrick's Day.
It is a phenomenal historical irony.
Isn't it?
The single day of the year that the entire globe associates with Irish pub culture was legally dry in its homeland for 34 years.
34 years.
The government literally forced the pubs to lock their doors to curb public intoxication and force the population to keep the focus strictly on religious piety.
Think about that. For over 3 decades, if you walked into Dublin on St. Patrick's Day wanting a pint, you were out of luck.
Completely out of luck.
Meanwhile, if we look at the sources for Northern Ireland during the latter half of the 20th century, the history of the holiday took a much darker, much more complicated path. And we just want to impartially report on the sources here because the history is heavily tied to the Troubles.
Right. In Northern Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was deeply entangled in the political and sectarian conflict known as the Troubles, which lasted from the late 1960s to the late 1990s.
And the population was very divided.
Yes, roughly divided. You had a majority of Protestant Ulster Unionists who saw themselves primarily as British, and a substantial minority of Catholic Irish nationalists who saw themselves primarily as Irish.
And because of that severe demographic divide, our sources show the holiday became highly polarized.
Extremely polarized. The Unionist government in Northern Ireland did not officially observe the holiday. During the decades of the Troubles, public celebrations were rare and were almost exclusively associated with the Catholic nationalist community.
And tragically, the day sometimes became a flashpoint for the ongoing violence. The sources recount that in 1976, loyalist paramilitaries detonated a car bomb outside a pub crowded with Catholics celebrating St. Patrick's Day in Dungannon.
Yes, the blast killed 4 civilians and injured many others. It was a horrific event.
So the sources show it remained a deeply fractured day for a long time.
It did. There were gradual attempts to shift the narrative over the years. In 1985, some Protestant Unionists attempted to reclaim a connection to the festival, with the Orange Order holding its own St. Patrick's Day parade.
Okay.
But the definitive turning point came with the end of the conflict. Following the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, the political landscape transformed.
And how did that affect the holiday?
Well, towns throughout Northern Ireland began organizing cross-community St. Patrick's Day parades. These were deliberately designed to draw thousands of spectators from all backgrounds, turning a symbol of division into an exercise in shared cultural space.
Which is an incredible shift. And right around that same time, in the mid-1990s, the Republic of Ireland had a massive realization of its own.
They really woke up to what was happening globally.
Yeah, the government looked at how the rest of the world, places like New York, Chicago, Sydney, was celebrating March 17th. And they realized they were sitting on a gold mine of soft power that they were entirely ignoring.
They finally recognized that this exported, slightly chaotic diaspora festival was an unparalleled tool for global public relations. So the Irish government deliberately set out to reclaim ownership of the holiday.
And that led to the big festival, right?
Exactly. In 1996, they launched the very first St. Patrick's Festival in Dublin. The strategic goal was to project an accurate, modern image of Ireland as a dynamic, creative, and sophisticated country.
While also finally giving international tourists the massive, multi-day party they had come to expect.
Right? They gave the people what they wanted.
They essentially licensed their own culture back from the diaspora, upgraded it, and hosted the party themselves. And that 1990s push really sparked a global phenomenon that has now reached the most unlikely places imaginable. The sources detail something called the Global Greening Initiative.
Oh, this is fantastic. Started in 2010 by Tourism Ireland. This initiative involves coordinating with foreign governments and organizations to bathe famous international landmarks in green light on March 17th.
Wow.
It began with the Sydney Opera House and the Sky Tower in Auckland. Today, it includes over 300 landmarks across 50 different countries.
It is genuinely everywhere. I was reading about a tiny Caribbean island called Montserrat. Have you heard of this?
I have, yeah.
It is one of the only places in the world outside of Ireland to actually have St. Patrick's Day as an official public holiday. They literally call themselves the Emerald Island of the Caribbean.
That's amazing. Why is that?
Because the island was heavily populated by Irish refugees and indentured servants in the 17th century, they actually used the day to commemorate a 1768 slave uprising.
See, the way local communities adapt today is just fascinating.
Totally.
For example, for years, the village of Dripsey in County Cork proudly held the record for the world's shortest St. Patrick's Day parade. The entire route lasted just 23.4 meters.
Wait, 23.4 meters?
Yep. That was the exact distance between the village's two pubs.
I respect the efficiency, although apparently towns in Arkansas and Rhode Island are currently fighting over who gets to claim that title now.
Of course they are.
But the celebration hasn't just gone global, it has literally broken the atmosphere.
Yes. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station have made it a tradition.
That's so cool.
In 2011, an Irish-American astronaut named Catherine Coleman celebrated by floating weightless in orbit, playing a 100-year-old antique flute belonging to Matt Malloy of the traditional Irish music group The Chieftains. And 2 years later, Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield posted a recording of himself singing Danny Boy directly from space.
I am looking at all of this, and I have to step back and ask, why this specific holiday? We do not see astronauts on the space station busting out century-old instruments for other national days.
No, we really don't.
We don't see the Colosseum in Rome or the Sydney Opera House lighting up for someone else's Independence Day. What is it about St. Patrick's Day that transcends borders, cultures, and literal gravity?
This raises an important question about the sociology of the holiday today. St. Patrick's Day has evolved far beyond its origins as a specific ethnic and religious observance.
Right.
Because it was exported so successfully by a desperate diaspora, its core modern tenets, music, gathering, drinking, and wearing a bright unifying color, became highly accessible.
Anyone can join in.
Exactly. It transformed into a universal celebration of community and resilience. And in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, it also serves as a secular marker for the arrival of spring.
Just a reason to celebrate after a long winter?
Yeah. You no longer have to be Irish to participate in the underlying themes of survival and community joy.
So what does this all mean? I want you to look back at the journey we just took. We started with a kidnapped Romano-British teenager in the 5th century herding sheep in the freezing rain.
A very bleak start.
Right. That horrific experience morphed into a deeply serious, completely dry religious holiday in Ireland. Meanwhile, millions of desperate immigrants took his name across the ocean, slapped a political color on it that wasn't even his original symbol, and marched in the streets to prove their own humanity.
The layers of history are just incredible.
And today, people are floating in zero gravity playing flutes, while the entire globe is bathed in green light.
It is a profound evolution, and I think it leaves us with a fascinating concept to mull over. St. Patrick's Day is one of the rarest historical examples of a complete cultural feedback loop.
How so?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what happens to a culture's identity when its defining national holiday is primarily shaped, popularized, and commercialized by the people who left that culture centuries ago?
That is a wild thought.
Who really owns a tradition once the whole world is invited to the party?
I'll leave you to think about that. So the next time you find yourself standing on a street corner, holding a plastic cup of green beer and adjusting a cheap velvet leprechaun hat.
Try to remember where it all came from.
Exactly. Just remember, you aren't just celebrating an Irish saint. You are participating in a centuries-old story of survival, rebellion, clever marketing, and the unstoppable power of immigrants trying to find their place in a new world.